We turn now to hear a reading from the second chapter of the Gospel of John. I'm grateful to have the privilege to share this text with you as you begin this new series of sermons. I invite you to hear John 2, verses 1 through 11. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Did you catch the last verse of that text? Now, I'm aware it's a little later in the morning now than it was when I got to share this text in the early service, but some of us may still be enjoying, I guess most of us enjoyed the outcome of the Georgia football game yesterday. I heard that, amen. There may be some here, though, who have not heard, and we should pray for them, too. But it's possible that we miss what the fourth gospel writer says. So just in case you didn't catch it, the previous verse is under further review. Jesus did this, the first of his signs, at Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. I just want to suggest to you this morning that on multiple levels is an absolutely astonishing statement. In fact, I want to even suggest that if you all were on a committee that Jesus had established to help him decide where and when and how to begin his glory revelation tour, this is not the venue or the sign or the circumstance you would have picked. Just let me offer a few pieces of evidence. First of all, if you were starting a tour to reveal the glory of God in Jesus Christ, I want to suggest that you would probably recommend that Jesus start in Jerusalem. Isn't that where really important religious things would take place? But this happens in Cana. Like, if this hadn't happened in Cana, no one would even know Cana existed. Cana is a suburb of Nazareth. And you know what the Gospel of John says about Nazareth, right? Can anything good come out of there? Well, this happens in a suburb of a place nothing good can come out of. So if you were picking a place to launch a tour, this likely is not it. And if you're going to recommend a good way to demonstrate the power of God flowing through the life of the human being, Jesus, maybe you would have recommended, sorry, Jeremy, I don't want to steal your thunder for later. So just hang around for the rest of the series and see some things that would have made more sense to really get people's attention. But what happens here is that Jesus gets dragged into resolving a social embarrassment. There is a wedding feast at Cana in Galilee, and let's just say that it's not good Galilean etiquette to run out of wine before the reception is over. But sure enough, the reception is still going strong, and they're out of wine, and Jesus starts his glory revelation tour on the stage of that kind of social embarrassment. Surely he should be in the synagogue, at least, if he's going to be in Cana. Surely he should be in a religious event if he's going to be anywhere. But no, he and his friends are at the wedding reception, and they've run out of wine, and Jesus' mother is concerned for the well-being of the host, and that's where this tour starts. And then, while we're at it, reviewing the previous verse, like, if you're going to do the first of your signs, shouldn't you draw attention to it? I mean, shouldn't you put on a really big stunt that no one would ever forget? But if you read the text carefully, it's not even clear where the miracle actually happens. We've got these 6 stone jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. They get filled up with water, and somewhere in between the filling of the water and the lips of the chief steward, there's an extreme makeover. But the text doesn't say exactly where. It's just somewhere between the filling up of the jars and the tasting of the chief steward, the water has become wine. So that's it. The first of his signs at Cana of Galilee, that's the revelation of glory. I can't help but remembering the first time I ever heard the Methodist preacher and Bishop Will Willimon preach on this text. He just couldn't help but observing that this seemed like a really inconsequential miracle. I've always wanted to ask him if he could do it. But you'll have to admit, by Mount Sinai, world-shaking, water-parting standards, this doesn't seem like quite so much. So based on our review, perhaps we can agree that Jesus reveals the power of God at work in him in an unlikely place, in an unexpected time, in an unassuming methodology, among a group of people who weren't looking for anything holy at all. But as that truth begins to settle in your hearts and minds this morning, I want to ask you, don't you begin to hear the gospel? What kind of gospel would it be if the gospel of God's love in Jesus Christ was only that God shows God's glory in the places we most expect, in the times we most expect, in the ways we most expect, so that when we have our act together and when we know where to look and when we find ourselves in the right place and when we're checking off all the boxes and when we have our act together and when everything makes sense, then we see God's glory. Would that really be glory? No, the testimony of the fourth gospel is at a time no one would have guessed, in a form no one would have picked, in a methodology nobody would have imagined, there was an outbreak of God's glory. And by the way, it was no minimalistic outbreak. It was an outbreak in abundance. There wasn't just a tad bit of wine manufactured here. Depending on how you add and subtract, you've got between 120 and 180 gallons. That should hold them over for the night, don't you think? That's an abundance. In a different way, you can't help but thinking of that marvelous passage at the beginning of the Gospel of John. From his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. Grace just overflows. It just keeps coming out. It never stops. It's more than enough. Grace upon grace upon grace. Can't help but anticipating the prayer of Paul to the Ephesians that affirms that Jesus does abundantly far more than all we could ever ask or imagine. Isn't it good news? Isn't it gospel news that in a moment we could not have imagined, in a place we would not pick, in a way we would not have designed, grace shows up in abundance and Christ reveals his glory? I can't help but thinking this is a Baptist church and testimony is appropriate, I'm assuming. I can't help but remembering one of the first times I saw Christ's glory at work. Mark referenced already that this summer you had some youth in your youth choir who were on tour in D.C. That's an amazing thing. It reminds me of my own coming to faith in Jesus in my middle school years. The church I was a member of in North Carolina got a new minister of music, and part of his challenge when he was called was to rebuild the youth choir. The youth choir had fallen, and by the way, in the late 70s and early 80s, it's hard for a youth choir to fall in disrepair. But the one in that church had. And so he was hired to build the youth choir from scratch, which meant he had a major problem. He had to convince a group of teenagers who even in the early 80s would have rather been somewhere else on Sunday afternoon that what we really wanted to do was come to church every Sunday afternoon and then be the service choir for the Sunday night service. Sound easy? And that included a group of middle school guys like me who really thought we would probably rather be watching the second game of the NFL doubleheader on Sunday afternoon at 4 and not coming back to church. So it was the early 80s. We didn't travel much back then in the last century. And so he offered us a deal. He said, if you'll come to youth choir every Sunday and learn the music and sing at Sunday night church, even when they have church conference, if you show up then too, then at the end of the year, I'll take you on a tour. Well, that worked because, as I say, it was the early 80s. We didn't travel much. So he had us at tour. And sure enough, every Sunday afternoon we went to youth choir, and what he hadn't factored on, Mark, was we couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. And although he was good, he wasn't that good that quick. And on Sunday night at First Baptist Church in Winston-Salem, when nobody showed up, it didn't much matter if we weren't very good. It wasn't like we were going to be a draw. But come that summer, after that first full year, he had to keep his word and take us on a tour. And so he took us on a trip to the northeastern United States, upstate New York, New England, Connecticut. Don't get me wrong, we were not doing Madison Square Garden, and we were not doing any cathedrals. We were going to the kind of places he could convince to take us. And we were terrible. We were terrible at singing. We were terrible at following the instructions of our youth minister. It was so bad that on the second night of the tour, he said to us, if y'all don't get your act together, we're going home early. We were singing bad, and that was the best thing we were doing. So somehow, by sheer grace, we made it to the last night of the trip. And our last appearance, if you'd call it that, was at a little church in a town called Tolland, Connecticut. And we were the Wednesday night program. There were about 50 of us on the platform, and there were about 25, 30 deeply devoted followers of Jesus in the congregation. And we sang our program and did our thing, and it was, let's just say, Mark wouldn't take that anywhere. And at the end of the evening, the pastor of the church came and stood in front of the congregation and said, before I pronounce the benediction, I want to know, does anybody here in church tonight have anything they want to say to this choir? And an elderly lady sitting right about over there raised her hand and said, I've got something I want to say. And we all braced. Like, here it comes. But I promised before God that she raised her hand and she said, I want you to know that I have had an incredibly difficult year. 6 months ago, my husband died of cancer. 3 months ago, I was diagnosed with cancer, and I had started to wonder if the love of God was real. But then you sang that song, God's love is like a mighty river flowing free, and I knew it had to be true. pastor pronounced the benediction. Everybody left. We sat down on the stage in a trance. Because looking back on it, what had happened that night was at a most unexpected place, through a most unexpected, unimaginable form, in a most unanticipated way. Jesus' glory broke out and ambushed us right there in church. And I've still been trying to work out what it means to serve a Jesus who doesn't always show up in the places and forms and ways we would expect, but instead seems to have this predisposition for settings like Cana of Galilee, among people who no one would guess, in times no one would calendar, in occasions no one would put on a tour. It's there. It's there that Jesus does the first of his signs. It's unexpected, and that's why it's grace. But since the final verse is still under further review, I want you to notice one more thing. It's not just that it's unexpected, it is almost entirely, if not entirely, unnoticed. It's unrecognized. Now, the gospel writer has a convenient case of memory, kind of like maybe the minutes of most church conferences, where it says everybody all agreed and had a good time. Well, this is a little bit like that, because it says, Jesus did this, the first of his signs, at Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Those of us who've read the Gospels know there's good reason to ask, really so fast? But for the sake of right now, let's pretend that that's actually true. Even if his disciples saw, noticed, and believed, and spent the rest of their lives trying to figure out what it meant to be ambushed by glory in an unexpected place, no one else knew anything that happened. If you'd ask everybody else in Cana, did anything important happen last night? They'd say, well, no. And here's the proof. Don't take my word for it. Take the chief steward's word. When he has his taste test, he says, wait a minute, you've done this all wrong. This is the very best wine. And see, standard etiquette around here is you serve the best wine first, and then you serve the bad stuff later when everybody's too drunk to know the difference. But you've kept the best wine back when no one will notice. You see, if everybody is already intoxicated, if everybody's already had more than they needed, if everybody's already in the place where you could feed them junk and they wouldn't know the difference, then who's going to know? The very best, the most extravagant love, the most astonishing outpouring of grace happened of all places in Cana in Galilee, and the next day nobody knew. Which makes me wonder just how often that still happens. It makes me wonder just how often our Lord Jesus shows up somewhere, someplace, in some time, in some way we didn't expect, or for which we were not looking, or to which we were unable to give our attention for some reason or the other, and we didn't even know that we had been standing right next to an outbreak of glory so close we could have touched it and seen it with our eyes, but our senses were dulled and our minds were distracted and our attention was in some other direction. And if you'd ask us the next day, we wouldn't have known we'd been standing right next to the risen Jesus, or we had seen his glory. I think we live in a cultural moment where we are particularly at risk. Now, I'm not saying that anybody around here is mixing stuff in the coffee. But I am saying there are a lot of intoxicants in our world. There's the intoxication of social media. that conveniently keeps drawing us into places where we only hear the things we've already thought and think everybody agrees to us, and it's an echo chamber, and you sure don't need a God who can do science to engineer that. We hear the constant barrage of so-called opinion in news outlets and other places. And as if that were not enough, there's this constant barrage of religious speak that says, you know, best days for the church, that was back in the 80s, Baxley, when you were in the youth choir. And I'm not talking about the singing. You know, back then, the whole world revolved around us. Back then, everything just happened naturally according to our needs. Heck, shoot, back then, my mentor, Cecil Sherman, says he could stand up in Asheville, North Carolina and read the yellow pages and people would accept Jesus. We live in a world where there is so much suspicion and so much pessimism about the circumstances the church faces. I experience it almost every day because even this week I got one of those phone calls from a pastor. I'm getting ready to go preach in their church in several weeks, and the pastor said, you know, he said, I bet I'm the only person who tells you this, so I feel kind of awkward to say this, but, you know, God is at work in amazing ways in our congregation. And I asked him, why do you think I don't hear that more often? I want you to know I hear that almost every week. I see it almost every week. Almost every week I get the amazing privilege of preaching in a different congregation where I see the Holy Spirit giving courage and giving agility and helping congregations find their voice and helping congregations navigate new and unfamiliar space. Almost everywhere I turn, I see God's glory at work among courageous, committed people who are overtaken by God's love and are finding a way forward in a world that none of us could have imagined. But you see, even his question is proof of a way of thinking and feeling and acting that is in our world, dulling our senses, stifling our expectations, reducing our imaginations, drawing us into a lull. I came by today to kick off your series. And in getting ready to do so, I had this almost astonishing awareness. As congregations today, as Christians today, we find ourselves in a very unfamiliar space. It's not a season or a location or a moment we would have ever picked or recommended or imagined. Don't you see where we are? We're at Cana. And that's the place where Jesus ambushes us with glory and overtakes our imaginations and invites us to find our way into the story until his love flows abundantly, relentlessly, recklessly, resiliently, all the way until we stand on our feet and sing with new conviction. I've got good news. We're at Cana. And that's exactly where Jesus likes to show up and start a new thing. So lift up your eyes. Open your hearts. Take in the glory. And watch out for what happens next.